haunting tune echoes, but no one was near the piano. Welcome to Mystery Parlor. I am your host, Axon. Let's grow this mystery circle. Drop a comment and tell me where you're listening from. Your words bring this series to life. I always look forward to them. Now, let's begin. It was a Thursday morning in April, the kind that doesn't pretend it's spring yet, and I was halfway through my second cup of coffee in the front room when the doorbell rang. Fritz was in the kitchen, coaxing lamb kidneys into their second wine bath, and Wolfe was upstairs in the plant rooms, interrogating a batch of temperamental African violets. That left me, the one not on a first-name basis with begonias, to handle the door. I opened it to a man in a suit that was probably more expensive than the car I don't own. He was early 40s, clean-shaven, taut-jawed, and radiated a kind of corporate punctuality that made me want to spill something on him just to test his reaction time. "Mr. Goodwin?" he asked, as if I might be a dry-cleaning clerk who'd wandered up to answer doors by mistake. "That's what it says on my driver's license," I said. "You're punctual. That can be dangerous here. I have an appointment." His voice had the clarity of someone who expected elevators to arrive instantly and meetings to start on the dot. 11 sharp with Mr. Wolfe. Wolfe's 11 o'clock rule was firmer than the laws of thermodynamics. No interruptions during his plant time, not unless the building was actively on fire, and even then only on the second floor. If someone had managed to book this guy during that hallowed hour, either Fritz had suffered a head injury or something more interesting than begonias was afoot. I stepped back to let him in. "What's the name?" "Calvin Dartley." I was told to be prompt. He was. Wolfe would hate that. I led him into the office and gestured toward the red leather chair that looks comfortable and isn't. I took my usual perch beside Wolfe's desk. "You'll have to wait," I said. "He's upstairs breeding orchids with a level of focus most people reserve for nuclear disarmament." Dartley didn't nod, or smile, or twitch. He just set his attaché case precisely on his knees and stared at the fireplace like he expected it to do something. After 2 minutes, I gave up trying to read him. He didn't fidget. He didn't huff. He didn't even glance around the room. He just sat there in perfect stillness, like a banker waiting to reject your loan application. At 11:44, which for Wolfe is as prompt as a Swiss watch, the door to the elevator creaked open, and a familiar shuffling of 270 pounds began its deliberate descent toward the office. When Wolfe entered, he stopped a foot inside the room and narrowed his eyes. "You are Calvin Dartley." Dartley stood. "Yes, sir. I appreciate you seeing me." Wolfe moved to his chair and lowered himself into it, with the kind of effort that suggested gravity was an insult. "You requested this meeting through Mr. Parker," Wolfe said, steepling his fingers on the desk. "He owes me nothing, so I surmise you convinced him you had something worth my attention. That had better be true." "I believe it is," Dartley replied. "It's not a murder. Not yet, at least." Wolfe made a face like he'd just bitten a lemon, then gestured. "Proceed." Dartley snapped open his attaché case and drew out a single item, a folded program, the kind you get at Carnegie Hall or Lincoln Center. He handed it to Wolfe, who made no motion to take it. I did the honors. It was a concert program. Chamber music. The date was 3 days ago. "You'll want to look at the timing," Dartley said. "It was a memorial performance in honor of Mabel Dartley, my mother." Wolfe lifted his head half an inch. "You are her son?" "Yes, Mabel Dartley," Wolfe repeated slowly. "The pianist?" "She was," Dartley said. "Until 6 weeks ago. I knew the name. Anybody who had been within spitting distance of a radio in the 80s did. Mabel Dartley had played Rachmaninoff like she was inventing it on the spot." Wolfe, who considered most music frivolous noise unless it was Bach or played by silence itself, had once declared her performance of pictures at an exhibition tolerable. That was the Wolfe equivalent of a standing ovation. "She died of a fall," Dartley said, answering a question Wolfe hadn't asked. "Slipped and hit her head in the kitchen of her apartment. No foul play, no autopsy, no family feud. It was ruled an accident." I didn't dispute it. But now you do, Wolfe asked. I don't know what I believe, Dartley said, with a tightness that wasn't entirely grief. But I heard something at that memorial concert that shouldn't have been there. Something that hadn't existed yet when she died. That pulled Wolfe back slightly in his chair. Dartley pointed at the program in my hands. The final piece. A prelude, untitled. According to the MC, it was discovered in her papers after she died, one of her final compositions. They said she wrote it in late February. But I recognized it. Not the melody. The recording. I'd heard her rehearsing it. On the piano. In early January. Wolfe frowned. You dispute the composition date? No. I dispute the recording. The performance they played at the concert. It wasn't a rehearsal. It was clean, balanced, studio quality, a finished recording of a piece no one knew existed. But the timeline doesn't make sense. My mother never recorded it, and the only person with access to her apartment after she died was her assistant Clive Madden, who insists he found it in her archive. Wolfe turned to me. Archie. Yes, sir. You will retrieve this program, find Mr. Madden, and ascertain whether this temporal dissonance is invention, confusion, or deceit. If it is one of the latter two, you will inform me. If it is the former, you will not waste my time further. Dartley's jaw tightened. I'm not mad, Mr. Wolfe. I'm meticulous. If someone tampered with my mother's legacy, I want to know. If someone used her work to stage something, anything, I want the truth. And I'm prepared to pay your fee to get it. I'm not interested in your fee, Wolfe said. I'm interested in being left in peace, unless your suspicions warrant otherwise. They will, Dartley said. I think someone wanted that piece heard. Not for art. For message. The timing was too perfect. Wolfe sighed. So be it. Mr. Goodwin will begin. If you're lying or foolish, he will know. Calvin Dartley inclined his head with the gravity of a man who had never done anything impulsively. I'm neither. You'll see. As I showed him to the door, I asked the question that had been twitching behind my eyes since the start. What exactly do you think someone was trying to say with that music? He hesitated, just for a beat. Then, I think someone was sending a warning, or a confession. I shut the door behind him, turned and said to Wolfe, We're investigating a piano solo. Bah, Wolfe said. We are investigating a violation of sequence. If it's true, and in Wolfe's world, there's no greater sin than something happening out of order. By the time I'd finished my lunch, steak sandwich with mustard and a pickle sharp enough to wake the dead, Wolfe had retreated back to his orchids without so much as a grunt of approval. That was his way of green-lighting an investigation he didn't want to commit to yet. In Wolfe's world, everything had to justify its own existence. So if I wanted him to stay interested in Calvin Dartley's phantom piano solo, I had to bring back something that smelled at least lenny fishy. The first stop on my musical mystery tour was a 4-story brownstone on East 76, where Clive Madden, former assistant and full-time executor of Mabel Dartley's artistic leftovers, maintained residence. It was one of those old-money buildings that had seen enough remodeling to forget its roots. The buzzer panel looked fresh from a brushed steel catalog, but the stoop still carried the ghosts of pre-war boot polish. Clive answered on the second buzz and didn't bother with pleasantries. He buzzed me in, and by the time I hit the second floor, he was already standing in the doorway with a look that told me his patience came in rationed packets. You're from Mr. Wolfe, he said. Not quite a question. That I am, I said. Archie Goodwin. May I come in? He hesitated, then stepped back with the tight, reluctant grace of a man, clearing clutter in his mind. The apartment was clean in the way a hotel room is clean, everything where it should be, but nothing personal enough to prove he lived there. Did Calvin send you? He asked, as I took a seat in an armchair that would have been comfortable if it weren't so aggressively designed. You could say that. He came to us this morning with a program, a theory, and a whole lot of precision. Told Wolfe the piece played at the memorial for his mother wasn't just out of place, it was out of time. Clive crossed his arms. He's mistaken. You'll forgive me if I don't take that as gospel just yet. Tell me about the piece. He walked to a narrow shelf and took down a thin folder, gray with a single label that read, Untitled Prelude. Inside were 5 pages of handwritten notation and a CD in a transparent sleeve. He handed it to me like a sacred relic. I found this among her papers after she passed, along with the recording. She'd made dozens over the years, rehearsals, drafts, sometimes just fragments. But this one was whole. I thought it fitting to include it in the memorial. A farewell in her own voice. Was it dated? The recording? No. But the notation is clearly in her hand. She always dated her compositions, but this one wasn't. It doesn't mean much. She was getting forgetful in February, but Calvin says he heard her rehearsing it in early January. That implies the piece existed before its official timeline. Clive gave a short laugh. Calvin is brilliant, but not infallible. His relationship with his mother was complicated. I'd wager it colors his memory. Let's assume he's right for a second. If the piece was recorded in January and she died early March, why would anyone lie about the date? Clive didn't answer immediately. His jaw tightened. I don't know. There's no money in it. No scandal. It's just a piece of music. That's rarely true. Art is never just art. Not when there's legacy involved. He gave me a look. You think someone tampered with it? I think someone wanted it heard under very specific circumstances. And if that someone wasn't her, then the context matters. Clive exhaled and rubbed his temple. Look, Mr. Goodwin, I managed her affairs for the past 7 years. I've seen her at her best and her most incoherent. She was slipping, creatively and otherwise. Some days she didn't remember if she'd written a piece or dreamt it. Still, I said, holding up the CD, this doesn't sound like a woman forgetting. It sounds like a woman finishing. He didn't argue, which I took as progress. I slid the CD into my coat pocket and stood. I'll need to listen to this, I said, and possibly have it analyzed. If you've got any other recordings from the same time, I'd like them. He nodded and went to a drawer, returning with 2 more discs in handwritten sleeves. January rehearsals, Chopin, and Debussy. If she recorded the prelude, then you'll find it in the background. I thanked him, left, and by 4 o'clock was back in the office with headphones over my ears, comparing the 3 recordings in Wolfe's office, while he sat reading a book on Byzantine sources. Fritz, bless him, had prepared tea and kept his questions to himself. Wolfe watched me with the mild disdain of a man forced to acknowledge the existence of audio technology. When I finally took off the headphones, he closed his book with a sigh like it had betrayed him. Well, the prelude from the memorial recording doesn't match the ambiance of the January rehearsals. No same microphone quality. No background hiss, different levels entirely. You are confident. As confident as a man with no musical training can be. But it gets better. On one of the January recordings, there's a 30-second snippet that sounds a lot like the prelude. Just a rough idea. She plays it, fumbles, mutters something and moves on. So she had conceived of it. Yes. But the finished version, that's another animal. That wasn't found. That was produced. Wolfe narrowed his eyes. By whom? That's what we're finding out. But I'll tell you this. Calvin was right. Someone wanted that piece heard as if it were a final confession. And they had to make it seem like Mabel composed and recorded it near the end of her life. Wolfe tapped his fingertips together. That implies someone understood both the technical requirements of studio production and the emotional leverage of a final work. Did Clive Matten strike you as such a person? He struck me as capable, cautious, and not quite sure which story he's telling. Unsatisfactory, Wolfe murmured. You will proceed. Who else had access to the apartment? Matten didn't mention anyone. But I've got a hunch. Mabel Dartley wasn't a recluse. She had a circle. Musicians, critics, students. Someone else was close enough to her work to know this piece wasn't an accident. Then we must widen the net, Wolfe said, his voice low and deliberate. Make a list of those who stood to gain from the performance, the publicity, or the distortion of the timeline. Already on it, I said. Calvin's got a cousin who handles the family trust, a former student who teaches at Juilliard, and an ex-manager who now books concerts for a major label. Excellent, Wolfe said. Bring them in one at a time. Do not tell them the nature of our suspicion, only that we are assembling a history of the prelude. The guilty will either evade or overstate, and if no one flinches. Wolfe closed his eyes. Then we will listen again, closer. There is a message in that music. It is merely encoded. As I reached for the phone to make the first round of calls, I found myself wondering about Mabel Dartley. Not just as a pianist, but as a woman who may have tried to speak from beyond the grave. It wasn't often we got a case without blood, bodies, or gunpowder. But I'd seen enough of Wolfe's methods to know one thing. The right piece of music, played at the wrong time, could be just as dangerous. It was just after 9, the next morning, when I stepped into the Music Conservatory building on West 65th, a long steel and glass number, with too much polish and not enough soul. The directory near the door told me that Leora Bell, one of Mabel Dartley's last protégées, had an office/studio on the 4th floor. I took the elevator. I could have taken the stairs, but I don't like to overcommit before my second coffee. She answered on the third knock, wearing a loose blouse that made her look both like a poet and like she'd charge you for hearing her poems. She was around 30, curly-haired and barefoot, and gave me a brief once-over that said she didn't usually open her door to guys in houndstooth jackets with gum in their pockets. "You're from the press?" she asked. "I'm from Curiosity," I said, flashing a smile. "Archie Goodwin. I'm helping Mr. Nero Wolfe compile a chronology of Mabel Dartley's unpublished work." At the name, she visibly shifted. "Wolfe, as in the detective?" "The same. We're not investigating a crime. Unless bad acoustics count. Just some questions about the prelude that was played at her memorial. You were close to her. She taught me for 6 years," she said, stepping aside. "Come in. Don't step on the pedal board." I just tuned it. Inside, the room was a mix of order and creative chaos. A grand piano took up most of the space, and the rest was shared between bookshelves, dried coffee mugs, a chair that had once been ergonomic, and enough sheet music to wallpaper the Bronx. I took a seat by the window and pulled out my notepad. "When did you last see Mabel Dartley?" I asked. 3 days before she died," Leora said, lowering herself onto the piano bench like she was sitting down for a duel. She was tired, but still sharper than anyone I know. She played a Brahms intermezzo that made me cry. Not because she missed a note, because she didn't. Did she mention any new pieces? She said she was sketching something, a prelude. Said it was personal. Did she play it for you? Leora hesitated. No, but I saw the sheet. Notation in pencil, just a few bars. It was messy, not her usual clean style. Any chance you saw her recording it? She wouldn't have, Leora said. Not then. She hated the idea of anything being final. She always said the moment something was recorded, it stopped breathing. I wrote that down. Wolfe would like it. He had the same opinion about books being adapted into movies. But, I said, a recording surfaced. A full one. Played at her memorial. I heard it, she said. Her eyes shifted away. And I'm telling you, it was not from February or March. That was an old recording. A studio recording. She hadn't been in a studio in over a year. Now, we were getting somewhere. Who had access to her archive? Only Clive, she said. He managed everything. Scheduling, paperwork, recordings. He lived for her. Maybe too much. That caught my ear. Too much how? Leora adjusted the sleeves on her blouse and stood up, moving across the room to rifle through a pile of sheet music like it held answers. He guarded her work, like a zealot. I once asked to borrow a rehearsal tape, just to study her phrasing, and he lectured me about protecting her legacy like I was some bootlegger. Any idea where the recording was made? No. But if it was done within the last year, it wasn't in her apartment. The acoustics were awful. Small space, no insulation. That recording sounded like Steinway Hall. That sent a note. skidding down my spine. Mabel Dartley hadn't booked a studio in over a year, but someone had. And someone wanted that prelude heard as a final message, timed perfectly, delivered clean. "Thanks," I said. "You've been helpful." She gave me a small smile. "If you find out who did it, tell them one thing. Mabel didn't need to be manipulated to be remembered. She earned that." Back at the brownstone, I found Wolfe in the office at his desk, hands tented, eyes half shut like he was negotiating peace between Greece and Rome. I gave him the rundown, while Fritz delivered a plate of cold chicken salad that Wolfe didn't bother to acknowledge. "She corroborated Dartley's claim," I said. "Saw the prelude in draft form, never heard a finished version. And she's certain the recording at the memorial wasn't made in the apartment." Wolfe's eyes opened fully. "You believe her?" "I do." She wasn't angling for anything. Just irritated someone had tried to puppeteer Mabel's final bow. Wolfe reached for a paper napkin and dabbed his mouth even though it was still dry. That meant he was preparing to speak a longer sentence. "Someone produced that recording in a professional environment," he said, "yet attributed it to a moment near death. That is not simply fabrication. It is intent. And if it is intent, it must have a purpose." I nodded. "Fame? Money? Control of the narrative? Perhaps." He leaned back. "We must now examine who profited tangibly or otherwise from the inclusion of the prelude in the memorial. Start with the organizer of the event." That led me to the Parkview Foundation, a high society cultural institution that had the budget of a minor nation and the personality of a formal wear catalog. Their director of musical programming was one Orion Judell, ex-manager to the Stars, current curator of the Dartley legacy. Judell's office was a pristine cube of indirect lighting and geometric furniture. He looked like a glossy brochure, tan silver at the temples, and dressed in a jacket you could mortgage a house on. "Of course I remember you," he said when I introduced myself. "I saw you at the Lamson affair last year. You were the one with the witty remark about the pâté." "That sounds like me. I'm following a thread regarding Mabel Dartley's memorial, specifically the origin of the final prelude." He gave me a knowing look and tapped his manicured fingers on the edge of his desk. "A beautiful piece," he said. "The highlight of the evening. A fitting farewell. Recorded by her, presented as such." "That's not what I asked." Judell's eyes sparkled like he was enjoying a game he hadn't expected to play. "We received the track from Clive Matten, who insisted it was among her last works. We had it professionally remastered for presentation, nothing else." "Did you ask where it came from?" "No," he said, "because it sounded like Mabel, and because, frankly, it served the event's theme." That was the part that clicked. "The event's theme? You mean legacy?" I said. "A curated image." He shrugged elegantly. "Isn't that what all great art becomes in the end?" I stood. "Sure, but if someone forged a detail in that image, then we're not just talking about memory, we're talking about manipulation." He watched me go with a smile that had too many teeth. Outside, the city was warming up for spring, and I walked slowly toward the curb, my brain thudding with the cadence of everything I'd just heard. Leora and Calvin had both agreed Mabel didn't record that piece near the end. Clive had found it, but hadn't explained how it had transformed from pencil scrawl to polished studio performance. And Orion Judell had accepted it, maybe too eagerly, because it fit the narrative he needed. Back at the brownstone, I delivered the facts. Wolfe listened, unmoving, until I was done. Then he muttered, "We must determine who engineered the deceit." Clive Matten presented the recording. Orion Judell broadcast it. Leora Bell and Calvin Dartley dispute its origin. That is the quadrangle. "You want me to bring them all in?" "Not yet," Wolfe said. "One more, Saul Panzer." I raised a brow. "You want Saul to dig?" "I want him to listen," Wolfe said. "There is something in that recording that eludes the untrained ear, but not the trained listener. Bring Saul. Tonight." I picked up the phone. Wolfe never called in Saul unless the facts were about to stop floating and start landing, which meant the music that played too soon was about to tell us something none of its composers or forgers wanted heard. Saul Panzer arrived just before 8, punctual as ever, and looking as inconspicuous as a man with the best ears in New York could. He wore his usual gray suit, rumpled in a deliberate way that made people underestimate him, and carried nothing but a slim leather folder and his reputation. Fritz had offered him canapes in the front room, but Saul had waved him off, preferring to get down to business without the interference of anchovy paste. Wolfe was already in the office, sitting behind his desk with the recording cued on the reel-to-reel we kept for the rare occasions when technology had something worth saying. I sat on the arm of the red chair and handed Saul a copy of the program. He read it in silence, his thick eyebrows doing more of the talking than his mouth. "So," he said finally, "you want me to listen to a ghost?" "Not a ghost," I said, "just a pianist who may have spoken after the curtain call." Saul gave me a sideways glance, then took the headphones Wolfe handed him and adjusted the volume. He leaned forward, elbows on knees, and listened. Wolfe didn't move. He never did when Saul was concentrating. He considered it rude to interrupt a mind at work, which coming from Wolfe was a form of reverence. The prelude was just under 4 minutes. Sparse, haunting. No showy arpeggios or bravura cadenzas. Just something quiet, wistful, threaded with pauses that made you think the pianist might stop altogether, but never quite did. When it ended, Saul sat still for another 10 seconds, as if expecting an epilogue only he could hear. He removed the headphones and blinked twice. "Well?" Wolfe asked. "It's not from her apartment," Saul said flatly. "Studio mic placement, overhead. The sound is too clean. Room tone tells you it was a large, empty space, probably soundproof. Can you identify which one?" "Not exactly, but it's not just any studio. You can hear the bounce off polished flooring. That narrows it. A piano showroom, maybe, or a recital space converted for recording." Wolfe nodded once. "Go on." Saul opened his folder and took out a lined pad. There's a subtle edit at the 50-second mark. Hard to catch unless you're looking for it. The left-hand line shifts, minutely, like it was spliced. That means it wasn't a straight recording. It was assembled. Wolfe frowned. "You are certain?" "Yes. Also, this prelude quotes from something. 4 notes in the 3rd measure. That's not hers. Whose then?" "Not sure yet, but it's distinct. Like a signature. Could be deliberate borrowing. Could be coded reference." Wolfe's lips compressed. I said, "So someone created the illusion of Mabel Dartley playing her own swan song by patching it together in a studio?" Saul nodded. "And they wanted it to sound natural, like a private recording. But they were too careful, which makes it," I said, "not a tribute. A construction." Wolfe steepled his fingers. "And as such, someone had motive, not merely to preserve memory, but to fabricate intent." "Archie." "Yes, sir." "Return to Clive Matten." Pressed gently, then rougher. "He must now account for provenance. We have enough to corner him if he is the cornered." "Understood." "And then," Wolfe said, leaning back, "we will draw our circle. 5 seats. Clive, Calvin, Leora, Jadelle, and 1 empty for the truth." I left Saul in the office comparing audio wavelengths like a musical bloodhound, and headed back to Matten's apartment. He answered on the first buzz again, which either meant he wasn't sleeping or he was expecting me. "I thought you might return," he said, as he opened the door. He had traded his tie for a sweater, but kept the same tension in his jaw. "I'd say I missed your charm." I told him, "But this isn't a social call. I listened to the prelude." So did a friend of ours, one with ears that could pick out a forgery in a Bach fugue played backwards underwater. Clive's face didn't change. And we know it wasn't recorded in her apartment. It was produced, edited, possibly even stitched together from multiple takes. So let's stop pretending you found a tape in a drawer and start talking about how that recording came to be. He turned away from me and walked into the living room, which I took as an invitation to follow. I stayed standing. I didn't forge anything, he said. But I did finish what she started. Elaborate. She had a rough draft. Sketches. She'd played fragments into her tape recorder. Little ideas, and she talked about it. A final piece. Something she wanted to express, but couldn't quite shape. So you shaped it for her. I compiled what she left. Cleaned the phrasing. Smoothed transitions. I hired a pianist who knew her technique. Someone who could play like her. Convincingly. We recorded in the Steinway showroom, after hours. You impersonated her. I channeled her, he snapped. There's a difference. It wasn't a hoax. It was a tribute. I didn't tell Calvin because I knew he'd overreact. I didn't tell the public because the illusion was the point, that she had the last word. And that word wasn't hers. He winced, but didn't deny it. Did Jodelle know? Eventually, I sent him the file with no attribution. When he asked, I said it was found posthumously. He wanted it to be true, so he didn't dig. That matched with Jodelle's performance, willfully blind, artfully evasive. And what about Leora? Did she know? No. And she wouldn't have approved. But Mabel never trusted anyone to finish her thoughts. I was the only one close enough to try. I nodded slowly. One more thing. The four-note quote in the third measure. That wasn't hers. Clive's eyes flickered. No, he said. That was mine. From a piece I wrote when I was a student. She liked it. It was private. Which means this wasn't just a tribute. It was a signature. He sat down hard, like something had given way inside him. I didn't think anyone would notice. Well, someone did. And now we've got a fabricated final work passed off as Mabel Dartley's swan song, presented at a high-profile memorial, boosting her legacy and yours. She would have approved. Wolfe wouldn't. And I doubted Calvin would, either. I left Mattern looking smaller than before, and made it back to the brownstone just after 11. Wolfe was still in the office, sipping a lukewarm beer with the distaste of a man forced to settle for hops instead of harmony. He admitted to it, I said. Compiled from fragments, recorded by a mimic, orchestrated for public consumption. Then it is settled, Wolfe said. He manufactured a fiction and deceived an audience. Should we bring them all in now? Wolfe nodded. Yes, but not for accusation, for confrontation. The lie must meet the listeners. Then we shall see what form truth prefers to take. I sat down, grabbed the phone, and began making calls. Tomorrow, 5 people would sit in Wolfe's office. One of them had composed a fantasy. The others had played along, knowingly or not, and Wolfe behind his desk would do what he did best, unravel the notes until the silence beneath them said everything. The next day dawned wet and brooding, a fine drizzle misting the city like someone had set the sky to low simmer. I got to the brownstone early, partly because Wolfe wanted all 5 of our guests present and seated by noon, and partly because I figured things might get interesting. Fritz had laid out coffee, orange juice, and enough buttery scones to stock a small bakery, but I knew better than to assume our visitors would be in the mood for pastries once Wolfe got started. By 11:30, they began to arrive. Calvin Dartley came first, in a charcoal suit with a tie knotted tight enough to garrote a horse. He gave me a curt nod and took the red leather chair without asking. 5 minutes later, Leora Bell breezed in, carrying a tote bag stuffed with scores and sheet music and looking like she'd barely slept. She gave Calvin a brief, unreadable look and sat on the couch without removing her coat. Then came Orion Jodelle, smooth and polished as ever, carrying nothing but an amused expression and a faint whiff of expensive cologne. He greeted everyone like we were all meeting for cocktails and opera tickets, then perched on the edge of the wingback chair with his legs crossed just so. Clive Mattern was last, exactly on time, his face pale and drawn, and his jaw clenched like it was holding in more than just words. He looked at Wolfe's empty chair and then at me, clearly debating whether to sit or flee. I gestured toward the remaining seat, and to his credit, He took it. Wolfe didn't make them wait long. At 11:59, the elevator door whined open, and the man himself entered, walking slowly, deliberately, and as unbothered by the gathering as a sultan inspecting his court. He took his chair, adjusted the angle of the blotter, and settled in like a man about to dissect a particularly stubborn lobster. "You are all here," he said without preamble. "Good. Mr. Goodwin has spoken with each of you. I have listened and I have thought. Now I will speak. You will listen. That shut down any chance of pleasantries. I have summoned you because each of you played a role, direct or passive, in the presentation of a musical piece at Mabel Dartley's memorial concert last week. That piece, the so-called Untitled Prelude, was described as her final work, composed and recorded shortly before her death. That description was false." Clive shifted in his seat, but Wolfe raised a hand. "You will not interrupt. The recording was, in fact, fabricated, constructed by Mr. Matten from fragments and drafts, left by Miss Dartley. It was performed by a pianist, instructed to mimic her style. The recording was then delivered to Miss Jodelle, who, without verifying its authenticity, chose to present it as genuine." He turned his gaze to Jodelle, who only raised an eyebrow. "It was beautiful," Jodelle said. "No one disputed that." "I do not dispute beauty," Wolfe replied coldly. "I dispute fraud." Leora sat forward. "She never meant for it to be finished. Not like that. She meant for it to say something," Clive said, voice tight. "Even if she couldn't quite finish it herself. I did what she would have wanted." "You did what you wanted," Calvin snapped, turning to him. "You made a fake. You used her name to send your own message." Wolfe cleared his throat, and even the air seemed to settle. "Therein lies the question," he said. "What was the message, and to whom was it sent?" He leaned slightly forward, which for Wolfe was equivalent to a shout. "Mr. Matten, you included in the prelude a sequence 4 notes, taken from your own composition. Why?" Clive hesitated. "It was a quote, a private nod. She admired it. I thought." "You thought," Wolfe said, pouncing, "that it would embed your fingerprint within hers, a final merger, a claim." Clive's lips tightened, but he didn't speak. Wolfe turned to Dartley. "Mr. Dartley, your objection to the recording is not merely factual. It is emotional. She didn't need help to be remembered," he said, "especially not from someone like him." Leora spoke, soft but sharp. Clive always inserted himself in her schedule, her interviews, her writing. Now he's inserted himself into her music. "She trusted me," Clive muttered. "None of you knew her like I did." "Trusted you to transcribe," Leora said. "Not to resurrect her." Wolfe raised his hand again. "Stop. You are not here to relitigate your affections. You are here to confront what was done." He turned to Jodelle. "You accepted the recording without confirmation." "I accepted the impact," Jodelle said coolly. "It completed the narrative, an artist's final breath, rendered in melody. The audience believed. The critics praised, and no one was harmed." Wolfe snorted. "Accept the truth." He leaned back and closed his eyes. "You are all guilty of indulgence." Mr. Matten forged. Mr. Jodelle broadcast. Miss Bell remained silent despite her doubts. And Mr. Dartley, though suspicious, permitted the illusion to take root because challenging it might cost his mother her final ovation. Calvin shifted. You didn't stop it," Wolfe said. "None of you did." Silence reigned for a long, taut minute. Then Wolfe opened his eyes. "The question now is what to do." I knew what that meant. The case, as far as Wolfe was concerned, was solved. The crime had been exposed, not of murder, but of manipulation. What remained was judgment. "I will not inform the press," Wolfe said. "Nor will I expose the deception publicly. That is not my role. But I will leave the choice to Mr. Dartley." Everyone turned to Calvin. He looked surprised to be handed the reins, but he recovered quickly. His voice was measured. I won't drag her name through scandal, but I won't let a lie stand either. He turned to Clive. You'll issue a correction. A statement. You'll say the prelude was posthumously assembled, that it was a tribute, not a true recording. And you'll sign it with your name, not her. Clive said nothing for a long moment. Then, with visible effort, he nodded once. Done. And the original recording? Calvin asked. Clive's voice was barely audible. I'll delete it. No, Wolfe said suddenly. You'll give it to me. Clive blinked. Why? Because it must exist, Wolfe said. But not in circulation. I will keep it. And if it is ever used again without the truth, I will know. And I will act. That was that. Wolfe never made threats. He made promises. One by one. They left. Calvin paused at the door and turned to Wolfe. Thank you. Wolfe only nodded. Then, once the door closed behind them, he let out a sigh like a volcano cooling. That, he muttered, was grotesque. I stood, stretching. They meant well, most of them. But you're right, they played with memory like it was a script, and gave it a new ending. He said bitterly, we are all authors of our own history, until someone else decides to edit. He reached for his bell and rang for Fritz. Dinner would be duck with morels, followed by a salad of bitter greens, Wolfe's idea of symbolic cuisine. As for me, I made one note in my book. Even music can lie, but only if someone tells it how. The next morning started like most others, with Nero Wolfe not speaking to me before his first bottle of beer, and with Fritz attempting to infuse breakfast with harmony using nothing but poached eggs and chervil. Wolfe had retired early the night before, presumably to think in silence or dream about 13th century Roman sources. As for me, I'd stayed up late listening to that prelude again. Saul had made me a private copy for contemplative purposes, and despite knowing every note was stitched together with just enough reverence to pass for sincerity, I couldn't stop hearing the lie in it. Not a malicious lie. Just the kind that tightens in your gut after the applause dies, and you realize someone edited the ending. By 10 o'clock, the day had taken a left turn. Archie, Wolfe said, summoning me to the office with a curt growl that suggested digestion was a secondary concern. I stepped in with my notebook. Yes, sir. He didn't look up from the piece of mail he was holding. It was an envelope, expensive paper, deep cream, unsealed. This arrived an hour ago, he said. Hand-delivered. That was already irregular. Mail at the brownstone typically came in through the slot like any self-respecting communication. Anything brought to the door by hand had the potential to either delight Wolfe, a rare orchid, cutting from Mr. Tressler, for example, or irritate him, anything else. He passed it to me. The envelope was blank, except for the word Wolfe, written in firm, angular letters. I opened it. Inside was a folded sheet of heavy writing paper, unlined. No watermark. The message read, "You were wrong. The piece was real. She recorded it herself. You've dishonored her." No signature. No date. Just those 4 sentences. Wolfe watched me read it, then asked, "Well, I'd say our orchestra has a conductor." He grunted. I studied the handwriting again. It was written in dark blue ink fountain pen. By the way, it thickened slightly on the downstrokes. Sharp angles. Confident motion. No hesitation. I'll compare it against known samples from Clive, Leora, Calvin, and Jodelle, I said. Wolfe nodded. Also Saul. Saul. Wolfe closed his eyes briefly. He wouldn't deceive me, but he might test me. I raised an eyebrow, but I knew better than to press. Do you think this means someone's trying to reverse the confession? No, Wolfe said. It means someone regrets the exposure. That is different. I left him with the envelope and did the rounds. First stop was Leora Bell. She was in a rehearsal studio on the Upper West Side, working with a young soprano who looked like she'd never heard of nerves. I waited until the aria ended, then stepped in quietly. "Got a moment?" I asked. She came out to the hallway and glanced at the envelope in my hand. "You think I sent that? You were in the room. You cared. And you're a musician." Emotional follow-through is practically in the job description. She didn't smile. I hated what Clive did. But I didn't write that. And I wouldn't pretend she finished something she didn't. I believe you, I said. And I did. Her anger had been too honest. Try Jodelle, she added. He's always 2 steps behind his own morality. Jodelle, however, was on a flight to London. His assistant told me so in the tone people use to remind you you're not on the list. I logged that but didn't waste time pressing it. Next was Calvin Dartley. He was less accommodating. I already got your answers, he said when I caught him outside the foundation offices. And I signed off on Clive's statement. It's over. Maybe not. Someone dropped this off this morning. No signature. But it implies the recording was real. He took it, read it, and exhaled through his nose. I didn't write this, he said. But I know who might have. Go on. He hesitated. There's someone I didn't mention before. Because I didn't think they were relevant. My mother's last student, an online-only protégé, remote lessons, an enthusiast. His name's Edgar Prell. Why didn't you mention him? Because I barely knew he existed. She only brought him up once, said he was persistent, and had an excellent ear. I think Clive tried to shut him out, but he kept contacting her. He claimed he could hear things in her music others missed. Fanboy or fanatic? I don't know. But if anyone believed that Prelude was hers down to the breath between phrases, it might be him. I got an address from Calvin and headed to a 3rd-floor walk-up in Murray Hill. The mailbox said, Prell in all caps. No doorbell, just a worn brass knocker and a handwritten note taped below. I do not take students. I study music, not people. A promising start. I knocked. No answer. I knocked again, louder. A few moments later, the door creaked open a few inches, revealing a man in his 20s with narrow eyes and fingers stained with graphite and ink. Yes? Mr. Prell? I'm Archie Goodwin. I'd like to ask you about Mabel Dartley. The door closed. Then it opened wider. He stepped back silently to let me in. The apartment was a monk's cell of music. A keyboard, a pair of speakers, stacks of notation paper, one bookshelf. No chairs. I remained standing. I heard you studied with her, I said. He didn't answer directly, just stared at me, then said, the Prelude was hers. How do you know? Because I've listened to every known recording of her in existence. I can tell you which way she breathes after the B-flat in her Chopin Nocturne. The Prelude, they say it's fabricated, but it is her. It sounds like a woman at the end of something. It was constructed by Clive Matten. That's what they say. That's what they say. Did you leave a note for Wolfe? He said nothing. I stepped closer. It was delivered by hand. No signature, just a conviction, like yours. Still nothing. I tried a different tack. If she recorded it, where? When? There's no studio record, no date, no witnesses. He looked at me then, like I'd asked if grass really needed sun. You think everything leaves a record. Art isn't always obedient. Sometimes it hides. And sometimes people invent what they want to find. He smiled, but it was bitter. Even a forgery can be true. I left him there, in his temple of reverb and conviction, and returned to the brownstone. Wolfe was in the dining room, sipping beer. I gave him the update. He's not dangerous, I said. Just devout. If anyone wanted to believe in a sacred final message, it was Edgar Prell. And if anyone left that note, it was probably him. Wolfe nodded slowly. Then let it be. No confrontation. No need. The truth is now layered. The Prelude is both false and authentic, assembled, but containing her shadow. That is the danger of incomplete legacies. Someone will always try to finish them. He closed his eyes. Fritz, he called. I will take the duck roulettes now. I returned to the office and looked once more at the note. It wasn't the handwriting that struck me this time. It was the last line. You've dishonored her. That's what people forget. A lie told for beauty's sake is still a lie, But for those who loved the beauty, it feels like the only truth worth keeping. And sometimes, that's the final trap. Even music can lie. But sometimes, it lies with love. Wolfe was uncharacteristically quiet the next day. By quiet, I don't mean his usual state of dignified silence, punctuated only by an occasional grunt of disapproval when I brought him an update, not up to his standards. I mean something closer to intellectual retreat. He spent most of the morning in the plant rooms with Theodore, refusing interruptions, declining even Fritz's duck eggs, and emerging just before lunch with a face like carved granite and the glint of slow, cold fire in his eyes. I knew that expression. It meant he was thinking deeply, methodically, and probably in a direction I hadn't yet considered. He descended into the office at exactly 12:58, just early enough for Fritz's punctuality to stay intact, and took his seat behind the desk without a word. I followed him in, shut the door, and waited. I didn't offer a report or a wisecrack. I didn't even reach for the coffee. I let him lead. He did. "Archie," he said at last, eyes fixed on the blotter. "I have made a mistake." That, coming from Wolfe, was like hearing the Empire State Building admit it had a slight wobble. "Really?" I said, trying not to grin. "Should I be writing this down?" He ignored me, which was fair. I assumed Clive Matten's actions sprang from ego, a desire to imprint himself upon Mabel Dartley's legacy. I assumed Jadell's complicity was opportunistic. And I assumed the audience's belief, their hunger for a final masterpiece, was merely a symptom of sentimentality. Sounds like a good run of assumptions. It was incomplete. He looked up at me now, that rare spark of speculative disdain in his eye. "There is a missing piece." I sat back in the red chair. "We've identified the forgery, exposed the assembler, traced the delivery, and tracked the fallout. What are we missing? Intention," he said. "True intention." I leaned forward slightly. "You don't believe Clive was just trying to honor her?" "No," Wolfe said flatly. "He lied with care, but not with purpose. His additions were self-serving, yes, but small. What concerns me is the prelude itself. The music? Yes. Or more precisely, the message in it." I blinked. "We're back to that?" Wolfe tapped his fingers together. Saul was correct. The quoted sequence, 4 notes in the third measure, is distinct. Not just a musical signature, it is a cipher. Wait. A code. Wolfe nodded once. "I had Fritz bring me the original sheet music from Matten's folder. It matches the recorded version. Every note. And that sequence? It spells something. Not musically, but typographically. You're going to have to walk me through this." He reached into the drawer and retrieved a copy of the sheet. Sliding it across the desk, he pointed to 4 notes. A, D, B, an odd progression. Not dissonant, but deliberate, played in isolation. It means nothing, but transposed through a simple substitution. First letter of each. A, T, T, C, I said aloud. "Could be initials. Or a pattern," Wolfe said. I reviewed her correspondence. In her early work, Mabel Dartley used musical initials in dedications, often coded D for Dartley, C for Clive, B for her sister Beatrice, who died young. But A. He paused. "That's new, Archie?" I offered. "Because why not?" Wolfe gave me a look that could have curdled cream. "No, not you. A is for Avery." That gave me pause. Avery, Florence Avery, the music historian. She wrote a profile of Dartley for Musica Antiqua 10 years ago. They corresponded extensively. I had assumed their contact was academic, but one of the surviving letters from Dartley references a final piece for FF. My mind shifted into gear. And this prelude could be it? Possibly. But Florence Avery is dead. 5 years now, I said. Cancer. Wolfe nodded. But Dartley's dedication suggests the piece, its core idea, predated that. And here is the twist. In Avery's annotated biography of Dartley, there's an appendix. Not published, but kept in Avery's private papers. A collection of thematic obsessions, recurring intervals, codified signatures. And you have this appendix. Wolfe tapped the folder on his desk. I asked Saul to retrieve it from the Columbia archive last night. Of course he had. I hadn't even seen Saul come in. The sequence ADBC is marked, labeled as incomplete closure. A motif Dartley used only 3 times in her entire career. Once, following the death of her sister. Once, after a collapsed marriage. And once briefly in an abandoned nocturne in the same key as the prelude. Minor E-flat. I said, recalling from Saul's earlier dissection. Yes, Wolfe said. The key of remembrance, in her notation. All of this implies that the prelude was not merely a constructed swan song. It was a private code. I exhaled slowly. So Clive didn't just forge her style. He may have unwittingly assembled something real, a message she never intended for public ears. Precisely, Wolfe said, which reframes the deception. He stood. Wolfe almost never stood during a discussion. When he did, it meant a corner had been turned. Call them back, he said. Matten, Dartley, Juddle, and Leora Bell. Tonight, 7 o'clock. Here. No exceptions. I stood too. You're going to tell them she spoke after all. Not aloud, Wolfe said. But with her hands. I made the calls. No one was thrilled, but they agreed. They always do when Wolfe's tone gets clipped and final. Even Juddle, who probably considered himself too fabulous for follow-up visits, agreed with a breezy one last aria then. At 7 on the dot, they arrived. This time Wolfe didn't waste ceremony. He entered, greeted no one, and sat at his desk with the copy of the score in front of him. You are here, he said, because the matter is not closed. Clive stiffened in his seat. I gave you the truth. No, Wolfe said. You gave me your truth. But Mabel Dartley left hers, embedded. He held up the sheet. The prelude you assembled, however manipulated, contains a cipher, a personal code. A message built into the structure. The motif ADBC appears not once, but twice. Both times in moments of pause, both unresolved, both contextually linked to private grief. Juddle looked confused. You're saying the piece wasn't a tribute? I'm saying, Wolfe replied. It was an epitaph, for someone you didn't know. He let that settle, then added. She was composing a memory, not for the world. For one person. A dead woman. Florence Avery. Silence. Laura was the first to speak. But she never mentioned. She wouldn't, Wolfe said. Because the piece was incomplete. Because she couldn't finish it. Because the grief was too raw. That's why she never titled it. Never recorded it. She feared it, Clive whispered. And I forced it. Yes, Wolfe said. You completed the ghost. Not knowing it was built on one. Calvin looked ill. Juddle for once was speechless. I won't ask you to erase it, Wolfe said finally. But you will no longer present it as her intended farewell, because it was never meant to be heard by you. He folded the score. It was meant for silence. They left quieter than they'd come. That night, Wolfe didn't request beer. He didn't even summon Fritz. He sat in his chair and stared at nothing for a full hour. I didn't disturb him. I listened to the prelude again, once, through headphones. And this time, I didn't hear the forgeries. I heard a goodbye unfinished, unsure but real. Not a masterpiece. Just a final attempt to remember someone who mattered. Sometimes that's all music is. And sometimes, that's enough. By the next morning the brownstone had returned to its usual rhythms. Fritz's apricot glaze over cornbread scones, the hum of the elevator as it carried Wolfe up to the orchids, and my own fingers itching to file away the remains of a case that hadn't involved murder, bribery, or blackmail. Just a single piece of music played at the wrong time for the wrong reasons. But the thing about Nero Wolfe is that he doesn't believe in closing a case until every final note has been resolved. and I had the growing suspicion that this particular melody still had one or two unresolved cadences hiding in its structure. At 10:20, while I was rereading my notes from our last confrontation with the quartet of musical revisionists, the phone rang. "Goodwin," I said. The voice on the other end was soft, feminine, and unfamiliar. "Mr. Goodwin," she said, "I need to speak with Mr. Wolfe. It concerns Mabel Dartley." I straightened. "Who's calling?" "My name is Lydia Prell, Edgar's sister." That caught me. Edgar Prell, the fanatic recluse who'd practically built a shrine to Dartley in his studio apartment, and who might have been the author of that anonymous note. I hadn't thought we'd hear from him again. "He's not here," I said, "but I can take a message." "No, I think I need to come there. I've found something in Edgar's things." That sent a little trill down my spine. "I'll check with Mr. Wolfe," I said. "Call me back in 10 minutes. I rang the buzzer to the plant room, and Wolfe responded with a grunt that might have meant come up or go away, but I took the gamble. He was seated on his stool, a pair of micro shears in hand, trimming a stubborn tendril from a Vanda tricolor. Theodore was hovering in the corner, ready to argue about humidity settings. Wolfe barely glanced at me. "Yes, I got a call from Lydia Prell," I said. "Sister of Edgar. Says she's found something related to Mabel Dartley. Wants to bring it here." He scowled. "What sort of something?" She didn't say, but she sounded serious. He snipped the final tendril, dropped the shears in a tray, and turned to me with the look of a man who deeply resents being intrigued. "Very well, 4 o'clock. Inform Fritz." That was as good as a presidential decree. I called her back and gave her the time. She thanked me in a voice that had the tired shape of someone not used to making urgent decisions. At precisely 4, she arrived. She was in her early 30s, trim, unadorned, with a librarian's composure and a nurse's wary eyes. She held a manila envelope clutched to her chest, like it might slip away if she relaxed her grip. Fritz led her into the office. Wolfe was at his desk, upright and still. I stood by the windows, arms crossed. She sat in the red chair and looked around with the kind of reverence people usually reserve for old cathedrals or first editions. "Miss Prell," Wolfe said, "you have information." She nodded and opened the envelope. This was in Edgar's apartment, hidden in a drawer beneath the keyboard. "I found it 2 days ago. I didn't know what it meant at first." She removed a cassette tape, old but clean, labeled in narrow block letters, "Farewell, F.A." Wolfe tilted his head. "E.M.D. Mabel Dartley," she said. Her full name was Elaine Mabel Dartley. I took the tape carefully and turned it over. It was one of the high-end studio cassettes from the late 90s, the kind only audiophiles or professionals ever used. "I found a small recorder in the same drawer," Lydia said. "A Marantz portable. He used it to capture off-radio performances. But this wasn't a radio recording." "How do you know?" I asked. "Because I listened." Her voice quivered slightly. "It's Mabel Dartley. Leave, speaking, introducing the piece." That stunned even Wolfe into silence. She says the name of the piece. She dedicates it. She explains why she can't finish it. Lydia reached into the envelope again and withdrew a small sheet of thick paper, folded twice. On it was a short note, handwritten in blue ink, for Florence. "My last breath, though not my last note. It's not complete, but it's what I have left. E.M. I think Edgar found this," Lydia said. "I think he kept it secret, even from Clive, especially from him." Wolfe reached out and, with great care, accepted the note. "Why bring it to me?" he asked. "Because you're the only one who listened to the silence," she said. I called Saul. He came within an hour, cassette deck in hand, and we wired the tape into Wolfe's office sound system. No fanfare, no frills, just 4 people, Wolfe, Saul, Lydia, and myself, gathered around a truth too fragile for applause. The tape clicked on. There was a bit of hiss. Then her voice measured. Husky, unmistakably hers. "This is for Florence. I don't know what else to say. I've tried to write it down and it keeps falling apart. So I'm going to play what I know and hope it finds its way. Then the piano. Not the version Clive had assembled. Rawer, slower, a half-sketched idea, not a performance. Notes that reached and hesitated. The same ADBC motif, but in fragments. No flourish, no polish, just something very, very real. And then her voice again, almost a whisper. If someone finds this, don't pretend it was more than it was. It's not finished, but it was honest. Click. Wolfe said nothing for a long time. Then he stood and walked to the windows, turning his back to us, his hands behind his back like a statue preparing to bow. Saul whistled softly. She knew, he said. She knew someone might try to reshape it. I looked at Lydia. Thank you, I said. She only nodded. Wolfe finally turned. Miss Prell, may I keep the original? She hesitated. I'll return it once it's transcribed and preserved. With no public release, unless you consent. She nodded again. That's why I came. After she left, Wolfe sat and stared at the machine. It was not a forgery, he said quietly. It was a resurrection. And she tried to stop it, I added. She failed, Wolfe said. Because beauty wants witnesses, and grief wants echo. That night we didn't speak much. Fritz served sole meunier and a citrus salad. Wolfe didn't comment on either. Before bed I listened to the tape once more, alone, with headphones, and I realized something. All those people, Clive, Judell, even Edgar, had tried to make the piece complete. But it was its incompleteness that made it real, because life never finishes perfectly. Sometimes it just trails off. And that's the truth we spend our whole lives trying to play, even if the music stops too soon. The following morning, I arrived at the brownstone carrying 2 black envelopes and a headache. The envelopes were from the Parkview Foundation, official-looking things embossed with silver flourishes that screamed gala or lawsuit. The headache was from staying up too late with Saul, digging through old conservatory records and chasing down the name of the pianist Clive Matten had used to forge Mabel Dartley's final prelude. Both the pianist and the forged legacy had gone quiet. But the ripples hadn't stopped. Wolfe's office was still echoing with that tape. Mabel's cracked voice, the half-finished melody, and that final plea. Don't pretend it was more than it was. I entered the office to find Wolfe already at his desk, a rarity before 10. He had the cassette sitting dead center on the blotter, like it was a relic from a cathedral. Fritz brought him beer, which he touched but didn't drink, and then he waved me in with a flick of his hand. You have something, he said. I do. I held out the 2 envelopes. Wolfe took them with 2 fingers and set them down without opening either. Explain. Parkview's planning a follow-up tribute concert. They've gotten wind that there was a lost recording discovered. Apparently someone from Judell's office leaked it. Wolfe made a sound halfway between a grunt and a snarl. Judell again, he muttered. Ambition in silk gloves. Wants to stage the piece as a re-debut. I said. Use the raw version, Mabel's true tape. Market it as an act of musical repentance. Lydia Prell got the same invite. Wolfe's fingers drummed on the desk, slow and deliberate. And how did she respond? She forwarded the invite to me with 1 sentence. Please stop this. He closed his eyes. I could practically see the logic pathways activating behind them. They want to trade one illusion for another, he said finally. The lie of perfection for the lie of redemption. Exactly. Bah. He didn't need to say more. In Wolfe's mind, truth wasn't currency for purchase, especially not in velvet-lined concert halls. I added, I also got confirmation that the pianist Clive used, Marion Dre, was paid under a pseudonym and asked to sign a non-disclosure agreement. She's refusing to speak publicly, but she told Saul she regrets it. Said the piece didn't feel complete. She thought it was a draft, because it was, Wolfe said. A draft. A farewell note never mailed. He tapped the cassette again, gently. This is the only version that should exist. But it cannot exist quietly. They will not let it. I didn't disagree. So, I said, what's the play? He looked at me then. Really looked. And there was a glint behind the weariness. We take back control of the narrative. By doing what? He picked up the phone. Call them in. That afternoon, the suspects know the participants returned to the brownstone for the last time. Calvin Dartley, stiff and silent. Leora Bell, anxious and alert. Orion, Judell, infuriatingly smooth. Clive Matten, gray around the edges and worn thin by guilt. We seated them all. Wolfe waited until they were still, then began. You are here because the matter refuses to die, he said. Because the lie you collaborated on, or allowed, was not enough, and now the truth has returned. With its jagged edges and its inconvenient shape, he gestured to the tape player beside him. This, he said, is the only authentic version of Mabel Dartley's final piece. Unfinished, intimate. Not for release, not for performance, and yet it is being pursued, for marketing, for legacy, for spectacle. Judell raised a hand. I believe the public deserves to hear the real piece, to understand her process. Her truth. You believe, Wolfe snapped, in repackaging regret as prestige. Judell's hand dropped. Clive spoke next. I didn't know she recorded it. If I had, you would have misused it too, Wolfe said. Because you cannot help but finish what others leave undone. That one stung. Clive looked away. Leora said softly, It's not ours to finish. Correct, Wolfe said. But it is yours to protect. He leaned forward. Miss Prell has given me guardianship of the original. I will not release it, but I will ensure its truth is not erased. He placed an envelope on the desk. This is a legal agreement. All of you will sign it. It prohibits any further distribution, reproduction, or performance of any version of the prelude, forged or authentic. Calvin frowned. And if we don't, Wolfe's voice dropped, then I will make the recording public. I will explain its origin, its misuses, and your roles in its manipulation. There will be no redemption concert, only exposure. Judell paled. You wouldn't? I would, Wolfe said. And I would. The room was silent. Then, slowly, Calvin reached for the pen, signed. Then, Leora. Then Clive. Last, reluctantly. Wolfe nodded. Good. It is settled. The music may remain as it was, unfinished, unembellished, and honest. That evening Wolfe retired early. I stayed in the office with the cassette player and listened one last time. The same intro, the same halting notes, but something had shifted. Maybe it was knowing what nearly happened to it. Or maybe it was the relief of hearing it untouched, knowing that for once we had not solved a mystery by catching the criminal, but by saving the victim's voice. Fritz brought me coffee. I thanked him and stared at the silent machine. Then I typed a line in the report for the files. Case closed. Resolution: protect the unfinished. Honor the imperfect. Let the music breathe. As I turned out the lights, Wolfe's final words echoed in my head. They tried to complete her, but she had already said enough, and that was the most complete truth of all. It was raining again the next morning, the kind of fine, slanted drizzle that made Manhattan look like it had been sketched in charcoal and decided to stay that way. Fritz had made cinnamon tea biscuits to celebrate Wolfe's unusually swift resolution of a case. No dead bodies, no police, and only one forged piano composition. But Wolfe declined them, grumbling something about the cloying optimism of cinnamon. That told me he was satisfied but still stewing, which in his world amounted to calm. I, on the other hand, was feeling about as close to sentimental as I ever get. Maybe it was the rain. Maybe it was the tape. Maybe it was the rare sense that for once, we hadn't cornered someone into a confession. They'd cornered themselves, and Wolfe had simply held up a mirror. By 10 o'clock, the office was quiet. The orchid rooms were humming above, and I had just finished updating the case file. Final entries: Typed, archived, alphabetized. When the doorbell rang, I answered it myself. At this point, I was halfway expecting another forgotten relative or brooding musicologist to pop out of the ether. Instead, it was Lydia Prell. She wore the same raincoat she'd worn 3 days earlier, still buttoned all the way to her chin. Her expression was unreadable, but there was something settled about it, like someone who'd finally made peace with an unfinished story. "I hope I'm not interrupting," she said. "Depends," I replied. "If you're here to start a tribute concert, yes. If you're here to bring cinnamon scones, Fritz might forgive you." She gave the tiniest smile. "Neither. I came to thank Mr. Wolfe, and to return something." That earned her an invite in. She stepped into the office, just as Wolfe descended from the elevator, pausing when he saw her. He inclined his head, a gesture that in his repertoire stood in for both acknowledgement and courtesy. "Miss Prell," he said, "you are not expected, but you are not unwelcome." She nodded. "I wanted to bring back the original note." She held it out. Mabel Dartley's handwritten dedication to Florence Avery, the one that had traveled from a dusty drawer in Edgar's apartment to Wolfe's desk and into the center of a storm. Wolfe reached out and accepted it with the same deliberate precision he reserved for rare orchids or vintage sources. "I made a scan for my records," Lydia said, "but I think the original belongs with someone who understands it." Wolfe looked at her for a long moment, then placed the folded sheet gently into his top desk drawer. "It is safe," he said simply. She hesitated, then said, "Edgar thought the world was always mishearing things. That music was the only thing that told the truth, even when it lied." Wolfe's expression didn't change, but his voice softened a degree. Then he was wiser than many. She nodded, thanked us again, and left with the same quiet presence she'd arrived with. I saw her out, and stood a moment in the vestibule, watching the rain soak the stone steps. When I returned to the office, Wolfe had reopened the drawer and was looking at the note. Not reading it, just studying the shape of the writing like it might still have something to say. He closed it gently when he heard me. "There's a curious satisfaction," he said, "in preserving the incomplete." "You mean we did the right thing?" "No," he replied. "I mean we did the only thing." He shifted his weight slightly in his chair, which for Wolfe was tantamount to a shrug. "They would have wrapped it in ribbon, made it marketable. Clive, Jodelle, even Calvin. They wanted the comfort of closure, but art, true art, does not comfort. It unsettles. I've heard music that did both." He gave me a sideways glance. "Only because it finished on a major chord." I leaned back in my chair. "So what now?" "Now, nothing," Wolfe said. "The matter is resolved. The tape will remain in the vault. The signatures hold. The lies are neutralized. No concerts, no releases, only what was, which was a farewell no one was supposed to hear." I didn't argue. A few hours later, a small padded envelope arrived by courier. No return address. Wolfe took it, opened it with a letter knife, and removed a tiny item. A thumb drive, labeled in a familiar narrow scrawl. Her silence. We exchanged a look. It was from Edgar. I plugged it into the desktop. One folder, one file. The audio opened without flourish. No introduction, no manipulation. Mabel Dartley again. But not playing. Not speaking. Just silence. 22 seconds of tape. Hiss. Room tone. No piano. No movement. Only the ambient quiet of a woman alone at her instrument, deciding whether to begin. Then it ended. I sat back. "That's it?" I said. Wolfe leaned forward and nodded slowly. The silence before the first note, and he was right. That was the only piece of the prelude no one had tried to manipulate. We kept it, filed it, named it for what it was. Unplayed. That evening Wolfe resumed his normal habits. Dinner at 8, a bottle of Riesling, a lengthy discussion of beetroot as a flavor base. The music case had been sealed, the players dismissed, and the final note left unsounded. Before I went to bed, I checked the vault and saw the tape resting in its sleeve. Next to it I added one more label, just for the files. Case of the music that played too soon. Closed. No suspects, no murder, just memory, unfinished. I locked the drawer, flicked off the light, and headed up. And that, as Wolfe would say, was that. No gunshots, no jail cells. Just one last, lingering question, echoing in a room full of silence. What happens when a goodbye comes before the final word? Sometimes, if you're lucky, you let it stand. You leave it incomplete. And sometimes, that's the only way to tell the truth. 2 days after we locked the tape in the vault and turned our attention back to mundane concerns, tax receipts, telephone bills, a potential inquiry from a woman in Bay Ridge who suspected her cat of espionage, a letter arrived addressed to Nero Wolfe, hand-delivered, cream paper, wax seal. Wolfe eyed it as if it might detonate. He opened it with care and passed it silently to me. The letter was from Leora Bell. Mr. Wolfe, you did not ask for this, but you deserve to know. After everything, I went to the house. Mabel's, just once. I sat at her piano, which hasn't been moved since her death. I played the first few bars of the prelude, and I stopped, because that's what she did. We all wanted to finish it. Clive did. Calvin needed it. Jadelle tried to sell it. Even Edgar wanted to guard it like treasure. But it was never meant to be finished. It was the kind of goodbye that only works when left unanswered. Thank you for seeing that before the rest of us could. Yours, Leora Bell. I handed it back. Wolfe read it again twice, then placed it face down on the desk. She has understood, he said. At last. I nodded. Better late than never. Wolfe gestured to the side cabinet. The file. I retrieved it. Inside were the case notes, the signed agreement, a transcript of Mabel's recorded dedication, and a copy of the scanned handwritten note. I added Leora's letter to the folder and slid the whole thing into the second drawer, the one marked private, resolved. He leaned back and reached for his beer. It is not often, Wolfe said, that a case concludes with preservation instead of exposure. New territory, I said. Not entirely. He took a sip. I have often said, truth is not always a weapon. Sometimes it is a wall. I grinned. So that's your final word? No. He closed his eyes. My final word is that we must dine. Fritz has prepared roasted quail, and I will not allow the folly of musicians to interfere with dinner. He stood and shuffled toward the dining room, already slipping back into the comfort of routine like a cat, reclaiming its favorite chair. As I turned out the light in the office, I paused. The brownstone was quiet again. Outside, the rain had stopped. No more notes, no more recordings, just stillness and one final memory, sealed behind the cabinet drawer. Mabel Dartley's music would never be completed. And maybe, just maybe, that was the point. Maybe that was the point.